The red dress was strewn in the dirt, ripped into jagged ribbons, as though it had been pulled across barbed wire. Clara crouched in the dust, her shaking shoulders wrapped in a rough gray blanket. Her face was pallid, her breathing unsteady. But her eyes burned ahead, not with terror, but with something harder. It was the gaze of one who had just seen the world take something that it had no business taking. Just before, Dry Creek had been broiling under the sort of summer heat that could sear bacon on the blade of a shovel. The air shimmered in the heat haze, heavy with the scent of horse sweat and dust. The small marketplace was filled with activity. Boots scraping on porch boards, voices bartering over grain, the hum of daily life in a small town, until they arrived. 3 riders, spurs clinking, hats drawn low, dust stuck to old coats. No one demanded their names. No one needed to. The instant they rode into town, the gossip ceased, and the street dropped into a thick, crushing quiet. Clara had pleaded with them for just a few more days to pay the protection money. Her bakery's shelves had been bare enough that she did not care to admit it. Too many debts, too few patrons. She stood with her chin up, her voice firm, hoping reason could erode cruelty. But the lead rider didn't haggle. He grinned, slid off his horse, and grabbed her arm hard enough to make her jump. Then, in the presence of God, the sheriff, and every person in Dry Creek, he tore her dress wide open. The tear of fabric cracked through the heat like a lash. The sheriff was frozen. A grizzled old man with his hand on his gun, shaking, but never pulling it out. The other men of Dry Creek remained stuck where they were. They'd learned what opposition cost. Barns burning before dawn, cattle gunned down in the field, brothers into pine boxes. The 3 riders doubled over, laughing as they swung back into their saddles and discarded the torn fabric onto the ground. Hoofbeats resounded down the street until only the creak of a saloon door remained. Clara stood alone in the scorching sun, holding what remains of her dignity and tatters of dress. In that silent mass somewhere, a decision was made that Dry Creek would no longer turn its eyes away one more time. That individual was Ethan. He hadn't witnessed it himself. He'd been driving feed from his ranch at the outskirts of town, his shirt stuck to his back from the ride. By the time he pulled in, the crowd was breaking up and Clara was missing. A stable boy explained what had occurred without looking him in the eye, then retreated. That's when Ethan felt it, the gradual, weighty burn in the pit of his chest. He'd lived through a lot in his life. Fever had killed his wife 5 years before, and he'd planted her under the single cottonwood tree on his property. He'd remained by himself since then, repairing fences, working cattle, and avoiding other folks' problems. But Clara wasn't other folks. He'd been going to her bakery for months under the guise of purchasing bread. But it wasn't the bread that had kept him returning. It was she, her unassuming fortitude, the smile with which she'd greet him even on bad days. And now someone had attempted to rub that smile into the ground. That evening, Ethan sat on his porch in the dark, cricket's chorus echoing through the stillness, gazing towards the dim silhouette of Dry Creek. Here, there was law only as a term and sheriffs were fear. People lived by turning heads away. But Ethan understood one thing: if you continue turning your head away long enough, one day there is nothing left to look at. By dawn, he'd decided. This was not about heroism. And it wasn't revenge. It was about the sort of town Dry Creek would be for the next generation. And it was about Clara, about what a man'll do when he gets tired of things. A week after, the air was warm already when it started. The morning brought that hot, dry heat that signaled a scorching afternoon. Merchants were putting up booths, crates thumping to the earth, wagon wheels creaking over the dry street. That is when they arrived, 2 riders this time, not the entire gang. But the strut in their shoulders declared that 2 was enough. They prowled through the marketplace like wolves among sheep, lingering at each vendor, accepting coins, and occasionally more. When they came to a young woman selling eggs, one of them wrapped his fingers around her chin, leaning in too close, smiling like a predator relishing its catch. That's when Ethan emerged from the alley. He didn't scream. He didn't sprint. He simply walked, slow, measured, boots pounding in the dust. "Let her go," he growled. his voice low but hard enough to quiet the street. The rider jeered. The sound stopped abruptly when Ethan's fist connected with his jaw, and he went tumbling in the dirt. The other man's hand flashed toward his gun, but an older voice spoke across the air. It was Thomas, Clara's father, standing behind a barrel, rifle held dead steady. "Not today," he said. That was enough. A few more men came forward. Merchants, farmers, even the blacksmith with a hammer tight in his hand. The two riders looked around, saw the change in the air, and resolved they weren't being paid enough to die at Dry Creek. They mounted and rode out, leaving behind a street abuzz with something the town hadn't experienced in years. Courage. But if they believed it was finished, they were mistaken. Later that afternoon, in the rear room of the saloon, individuals congregated, faces stern, voices unwavering. Preparations were devised. For when the gang came back, Dry Creek would be prepared. 3 days later, you heard them before you saw them. Hoofbeats thundering, rifles banging against saddles. This time it wasn't 2 men. It was over 10, riding together side by side along the main road like an army entering hostile terrain. But Dry Creek was not the same town they rode through the last time. Behind overturned wagons and crates piled high, townspeople huddled in the dark. The blacksmith clutched his hammer tighter. The store owner grasped a shotgun. Even elderly Mrs. Harlow stood ready, carrying a cast iron skillet as if it had been made to fight. The gang dismounted in front of the saloon. Then a voice boomed from somewhere above. Flour sacks burst apart from the rooftops, shattering into puffs of white dust that blinded half the riders. The rest attempted to push on, but were met with barrels, sticks, and more than once the hard report of a rifle. One bullet hit its mark, sending a rider tumbling from his horse. The rest stood still, because this wasn't just Ethan in their path. It was the entire damn town. From each doorway and alleyway, individuals emerged, eyes tight, hands firm. The street awaited Ethan. He emerged into the open, struck the head of his hammer on the ground once, and declared, "Return here again, and there won't be an escape." He didn't yell. He didn't have to. The leader spit in the ground, gazed at a town no longer afraid of him, and ordered them to ride back. They went out slowly, not willing to look back over their shoulders. Later, word got out they'd discovered somewhere else to bleed dry, somewhere that didn't have a backbone yet. Dry Creek was still again. And this time, it was the kind of quiet that comes after a win, the kind that lingers after triumph. For an eternity, no one stirred. And then, gradually, people crawled out from around crates and barrels, brushing themselves off, sharing glances that said, "We actually did it." Clara walked across the street to Ethan. Her skirt ripped, but her head held in proud affirmation. She said nothing, merely met his gaze with a gentle, firm stare. He nodded barely perceptibly, the kind of nod that conveys more than words ever could. And in the days that followed, Dry Creek settled into a new normal. Merchants left their doors open without looking over their shoulders. Kids played in the street once more. And Ethan, he continued to work most days on the ranch, but every morning he found himself dropping by Clara's bakery. Sometimes for bread, sometimes for pie, always for her. It wasn't a romance that had been a whirlwind. It had been more steady, based on 2 individuals who'd both experienced loss, who knew the quiet solace of not being by oneself. The town did notice. They okayed it, because in Dry Creek, living wasn't about standing alone. It was about knowing someone had your back. Perhaps that is the true reality. A town isn't going to change because one man stands up. It will change when everyone collectively decides they've had enough of fear. And sometimes, the bravery to be the first one to step forward is the person you least anticipate, or the person you've loved all along. So I'll ask you, if you'd been there that day, would you have stepped into the street? Or would you have waited for someone else? If it transported you back to being in the dust and sun, give it a like. It helps more than you realize. And if you'd like more stories from the Old West, the kind that get you smelling dust and hearing the hoofbeats, hit that subscribe button. There's more on the way. And trust me, you don't want to miss it.